Hey everyone, Greg Maskell here with you. If you made the leap from Instagram to Facebook, thanks for joining us here on what we think is going to be a better connection. Greg Maskell here with you, joined by Mariko Rooks, member of Yale Women's Water Polo, but not to put your water polo beneath anything else, but you're doing, I think, some bigger work outside of the pool with what you're doing with the Alliance and the Racial Equity and Reform Task Force and everything else. Appreciate you being here. As we kind of hit on a bit on Instagram, and I kind of want to just get back to the start of that. But you talked a bit about the great research that you worked on with some others to kind of share a history of racism in aquatics, and we talked about kind of like the big bullet points, the big headline items to note from that. Just kind of tell us again, what are the things you really want people to take away from that data that you gathered?
I think, the three things that people can really recognize for that. And so, hi, I'm Mariko. Thanks so much for, if you joined from Instagram, thanks so much. My connection was being a little weird. And if you're here on Facebook, hello. But so basically we put together a 10-slide post designed to circulate on Instagram. And so it was me, some folks from an organization I work with that actually inspired me to do this, Changing Women Collective, folks from my old high school water polo team, and also folks from my college team. And so we all got together and produced this sort of 10 slide post on Instagram that talked about diversity and aquatics and race and sort of how it all goes together. And so I think the first thing that one can I really took away from that was that there's a long history of sort of legal segregation of folks in pools and of Black folks, Indigenous folks, and people of color not having access to pools. And that manifests itself today, even though obviously we love to pretend sort of very Jim Crow was in the past. We've moved on, we're trying to be like better people in a better society. The fact remains that most of those pools that were built in the 30s, 40s, and 50s are still the same pools that, albeit really remodeled, that we're using today. And we're not seeing a ton of pools being built in predominantly Black and brown communities. So that still exists. And unless we actively do something to change that, that's what the status quo is going to be, because pools are really expensive to build. So, we just have to be really aware of the fact that where we're asking for resources is generated by this legacy of segregation. And that it's still very much ongoing in terms of also the financial burden to then, be able to participate in aquatics as well. And so the second thing would definitely be that, there are folks, I think, there are a lot of different small things that we can do when folks of color get involved in aquatics. Like, there are folks that are here. So how do we retain and how do we, make us feel like, right, our voices and our experiences are being heard? And so everything from, really thinking critically about, right, regulation swim caps, which often don't work very well with Black hair, particularly Black female hair, and regulation water polo caps, to sort of, right, how are we making the space accessible in terms of parent commitments, in terms of fundraising, in terms of everything. So that's definitely something we can think about more. And a lot of these changes are, not huge changes that we have to make at an organizational, institutional level. They won't cost $1 million. They won't require several rounds of like legislation or voting. They're just really small things that we can do that make a huge difference for folks like me and for other people in the community. And then the last thing is that there are also organizations run by Black folks and people of color that are doing really important work to access and equity. So the solution isn't necessarily to be like, oh my goodness, I need to create my own organization and have this, whole big thing. Just recognizing also, right, take a look at what's already existing. We talked a little bit on Instagram about Brenda Via's Project 2020, which has been rebranded as the Brenda Via Foundation. And so that's a really good example of folks that are doing the work to get aquatics into communities of color, and that work is being done for and by folks of color. So whether it's donating your time, whether it's donating your money, being really aware and listening to what do folks of color in the community want and what is already there, what can I do based on the infrastructure that already exists.
Yeah, really important stuff there. And as you hit on, they may seem like they're small things, right? Like a swim cap or a water polo cap, but those are the little things that add up to it being a thing that makes people not feel welcome, right? So to your point, you hit on some good stuff there. And for further reference, and we're going to share these slides as well, what Mariko is referring to is just kind of some of the bullet points, the headlines, if you will, of this larger kind of 10 slide thing that she was referring to, that really, really good detail, a lot of data. If you're interested in learning more, it's kind of an easy to digest but important understanding of the things you were just talking about. One of the things we hit on as well, as we were talking earlier, and you were kind of getting into your involvement with both the Alliance and the task force, was this idea of what does it mean to you and why do you do it? And one of the Instagram questions was, are you nervous to take on something like this? I was curious for your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think, always with a new endeavor, particularly one that's like public in the age of social media, like there are nerves, but they're the good kind of nerves, right? Like those are the kind of nerves that remind you that what you're doing matters and reminds you that what you're doing is important. And I think that's sort of right. We can equate that to like the same nerves that you have before like a big game or like an important game. So I think I feel those nerves. And then, but I think also, giving part of that and part of what sort of, at least for me, both in water polo and this makes me a little less nervous, is recognizing that, like, we're not going to be perfect from the start, right? We all have some sort of privilege or another. We all can do more. We all are continuously learning and growing human beings. And so I think recognizing that too, and I think taking ownership of that, but then also having that mindset going forward of like, it's a learning mindset, it's a growing mindset, and it's also a mindset that is, this isn't for clout, right? This isn't for personal gain. This is because it's something that we need and it's something we care about really deeply. And I think with the Alliance in particular, I definitely don't. And with the Equity Task Force, in both places, that's, I think the Alliance especially, it's been, the most folks of color play water polo in one virtual Zoom call room that I've ever seen. And so there's so much support and there's so much love and there's so much, there's just so much community that's being formed and has been formed in the past already. And so it's definitely like when you have a good team around you, right, that fear of failure, that sort of the nervousness, I think it means a lot because that people have your back and that they're there to support you, and that's huge. And for the Alliance in particular, it's designed to be a space for marginalized athletes and allies who are interested in everything from diversity and equity training to some of the research that I'm doing personally that's a little bit more like data driven, to just like programming for athletes who are LGBTQ, athletes of color, et cetera, just to give them a space and to give us a space, where we can belong, we can feel comfortable, especially for a lot of us who are coming from predominantly white teams, myself included. Just getting that space is really important. So I think in terms of balance, one of the things that works out really well is that at Yale, at most schools you sort of like see, right, first year to your last year, like your involvement in extracurricular activities increases sort of like, almost straight up. So like seniors are the ones that hold a lot of leadership positions. And at Yale, it's actually mostly juniors who hold leadership positions, juniors and sophomores, because it's sort of understood that like your senior year, you're working on normally a thesis, an academic thesis of some sort. You're trying to get a job, particularly now. We also have society, which is a sort of senior club thing that a lot of people do. And so it's actually, the timing has been perfect because I think, most people have, right, sort of disinvested from stuff that I was doing at school. And this is exactly what's supposed to fill that time. This is exactly why our structure works like that, because then you get to take all of these things that you've learned. For me, in this case, it would be organizing at sort of the Yale level within the Black community, providing programming for folks in the Asian American community. My actual jobs in both senses really involved sort of program development and academically doing a lot of data analysis. And now, like, this is the time, like, this is go time. We're taking it to the real world and really seeing how it can be applied on a larger scale. So timing actually is really perfect in that sense. And so I'm really lucky that, everything's come together the way it has.
You described one of those Zoom calls with the Alliance, and I think it was Ashley Johnson saying on the Julie Foudy podcast not long ago, we had this great call and it was almost like, why haven't we done this before, right? There hadn't been all these people of color getting together. You also, as a woman of color, it's obvious why you'd appreciate the efforts going forward, but you also don't have to be someone that is this invested in it, right? You're a college student, you're trying to get a job in a couple of years, you're doing all these other things. Why for you was it important to personally invest your time and knowledge and everything else into all of this?
Well, I think the people is like huge part of it. I think the mentors in that group are people that, you know, either like Janai were really important to me before this, or folks that I've met like Omar, who are now very important to me. I think, you know, the two aren't really mutually exclusive for me too. My actual sort of majors in school, and so what I'm, you know, doing as like my day job, really focused on public health and the intersection between race and racism and public health. And so when we talk about aquatics and we talk about racism, at the end of the day, not having access to a pool and not being able to swim is a public health issue, because, you know, you're not going to survive. And we've seen that. We've seen that the drowning rates for, you know, Black and brown folks are, you know, like 4 or 5 times higher than they are for, you know, white folks in this country. And that's the problem that also exists internationally. And there's been some great folks that have been doing some stuff in Britain as well. Their Black Swimming Alliance and stuff like that. And so, you know, for me, there wasn't that kind of dichotomy. It was just sort of like, oh, and because for me, starting to work with different public health tools like surveys, certain kinds of data analysis, it's actually what I'm doing this summer in my internship. So then when it was proposed for USAWP, I was like, oh, perfect. Like, this is exactly the kinds of skills that, you know, I have just been practicing, and this is something that's personally meaningful to me. And so that really worked out well. And I think, you know, part of it too for me is that, like, I chose, you know, not to play, and I chose not to really pursue water polo and put the time and the energy and the effort into it to playing at the level like folks like Ashley Johnson are playing. Like, also, I'm way too short to be able to do that anyways. But right, you know, the hours and hours, the hours upon hours that she's been training for the Olympic camp are the hours upon hours that I've been, you know, on my computer doing data analysis, learning how, you know, out in my community, speaking with people, learning how to present information, learning how to advocate, learning how to do community organizing. And so it really feels like a way to give back in a way that's super important, because I recognize that, like, you know, this is a need that we have, because again, right, like, you know, if you're a professional athlete, you're a professional athlete, like, that's what you do. And so it just very much felt like, you know, they have done so much for me in terms of making sure that I am welcome and that I feel like I have people to look up to in this space that is water polo. And those mentors and role models have been extraordinarily influential in making sure I stick with the sport, even when it's been really tough. And so it does feel like, in that sense, giving back, which is also a really big value in, like, the Japanese American community, which is, you know, where I grew up and where I'm from. So yeah, I think those are the two big things. Also, potentially will turn into my master's thesis. We'll see where this goes. So
there you go. It could check in, you know, quite a few boxes. We're talking to Mariko Rooks here, member of Yale Women's Water Polo, and also working on the Alliance and the task force. You hit on the idea of public health. I think that's a really relatable topic. Obviously, public health is very much top of mind with a pandemic raging. But I think for the general athlete, they often hear about the idea of prehab, right? Or getting yourself ready for sports that you don't get injured afterwards. And what you're describing at a very basic level, right? The more people that know how to swim, the less likely they will be to drown, right? So that's just a very basic way of looking at it in a topic that has many layers. As you work through these things, and we had a conversation not too long ago with some of your fellow task force members, Brenda Villa, John Abdu, among others, we talked about the idea, well, what does success look like with all of this, right? I know it's such a large thing, so it's not like you can say, well, we know by year 1 we're going to have this done, because there's so much work to do. So I'll kind of rephrase it and just say, how will you know that you feel like you're moving in the right direction? If we looked 9 months, 2 years down the road, what does that potentially feel like to you?
You know, I think for me, so for both of these organizations, I'm focused on the research end of it, right? I'm focused on the fact that, you know, we don't have a ton of ways to measure or for people to, like, sort of articulate how they feel or what their experiences are. So my goal is to be able to create tools, be it surveys, be it, you know, like assessments, things like that can really get at that information. And some of that is just great with interviews. And so, like, that often can be both personally moving and cathartic, but then also really helpful in hearing people's experiences. Some of that is just, you know, again, people sort of filling out things, ranking things like that. And so I think for me, in that sense, one, it looks like, you know, having that infrastructure developed so people know that this is there and this is the way that they can report things. This is the way that they can do things. This is the way of, like, I think so much of, right, we talked about sort of isolation in being one of the few people of color. It just means that like you kind of feel like you're going crazy sometimes. Like you feel like, you know, am I just imagining that all of these experiences are happening to me? Like, am I just imagining that, you know, this is what it is? And like, you know, we talk also about gaslighting, which is when people will purposely make you feel that way, not in a water polo specific space, but just in general. And so having those numbers, having the data say, look, like, no, you're not the only one who feels this way. You know, 800, like 500 other people have had these experiences too. I think that's what success looks like for me, is people being able to come up to me after I presented this or after we've sort of shared this with people. And that's what's happened with, you know, the Instagram post to a smaller extent, as well as saying, thank you for validating my experiences. Thank you for doing the work so that I don't have to try to explain this to every single person that I meet who is skeptical or who doesn't understand it or doesn't have the background. Like, being able to do that work and that kind of labor so that other folks don't have to, especially right when they're not, you know, like trained or familiar with like how to do like data collection and stuff like that. That I think for me is what success looks like on the research level. And then being able to present that data to folks who are in decision-making positions and have them go, oh, I can see it, this needs to change. And so that's, I think, the sort of the last part of it, is being able to, for me, actually be able to present those findings to say, like, here's what we can do, and here, you know, and here's what I can produce, and here's what we as a team can produce, that says, like, here are the problems, we have them very clearly laid out here. Now, here are ways that we can address these problems, and we can draw upon a long, long history of intervention work in public health, in community organizing, that deals with these same kinds of issues in lots of different spaces, and adapt that to our particular world and our particular sport.
And very helpful, because I think especially in any sort of big problem, right, people can feel overwhelmed and think, well, what do I do next, right? And so in your world, right, you're taking a very kind of data-driven scientific approach to it to kind of figure out exactly what those solutions are. You also mentioned having to kind of explain this over and over again. Hopefully we cut out some of that for you here by doing these conversations on a bigger platform, so people can say, or if nothing else, we'll just give you a YouTube link of this afterwards. And every time you get asked, you can just send off the link and say, here's my thoughts. And I've explained it very, very thoroughly. You can look through it that way, because especially in a sport like water polo, and you touched on it, I think earlier, if not here on Instagram, we're all aware it's a very white sport. There are teams that do not have a single person of color on their roster. They may go long parts of the year without ever playing against a team that has a person of color. And so they can hear these things come up and the need for change come up and kind of say to themselves, well, we've done nothing to make this problem, right? We haven't created this issue. As far as we know, we're doing everything we're supposed to do. And I know part of the role here between the Alliance and the task force is to kind of share that education, like, well, that's not enough, right? Because there needs to be a bigger and better opportunity for everyone. Just because you haven't been consciously aware of it doesn't mean that you can't do things to make this a more welcoming environment.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, you know, there's also, for the Alliance especially, such strength in numbers and being able to say that collectively together. So it's like, hey, like, this is what we can do. And also for the folks that, you know, are struggling, like, we're here for you, right? This is less about calling people out than it is about calling people in, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's something that really foregrounds like all of the work that I do as well.
And I bring that up because it leads into a question we got on Instagram before we signed off, but it came from one of our viewers that said, well, what are the best ways for non-Black Indigenous people of color to support Black Indigenous people of color in the sport of water polo? What can they do? What should they do? What should they want to do?
So I think the first thing, sort of, right, if you're a teammate or if you're a coach and you have folks of color on your team, if you don't, like, think about why, right? Think about, you know, how is your recruiting and outreach working? Like, are you, like, if you're a college coach, like, are you recruiting for programs that play, like, that, where there are, like, kids of color in those programs? Or are you just recruiting from, like, you know, like, Modern Day, Harvard, Westlake, all these schools that are also predominantly white, right? And granted, like, you know, they have great programs, great kids, great talent, but, like, also, are you looking at anyone else? Or are you even trying to look at anyone else? When you have schools like Commerce that are incredible, you know, have these really developed programs as well. So I think that's the first thing. So if you don't have folks of color on your team and in your coaching staff too, because also that's huge too, right? Who is in power in the room? Sort of like, okay, first of all, let's think about how do we get those folks. But then the second part of it being, you know, if you do have them, right, and there's a way to do it sort of without being, like overly sympathetic, but just sort of keep that in mind, right? That whenever you're talking to them, that whenever you're checking in with them, that whenever you're checking in with the whole team, what their day looked like, how they moved through the world that day is going to most likely be vastly different from the way that like your white players have moved through the world that day. And I think, this also applies beyond race to like, folks who are also like, who are in the LGBTQ community as well, right? What I've experienced when I hear the news cycle and when I hear what's going on, it's very deeply and personally painful as a queer person, as a person of color, right? And affects me in a very personal way that is, different than the way it's going to affect everyone else. I probably will spend more time, more space thinking about it. I think a, really recent example is like, just like Pose and like the Emmy nominations, like for me, just in general, right? Whenever there's an award show nomination or an awards nomination for anything, right? I'm always looking about, thinking about embodying, feeling for and with, folks who are included or disincluded. And, I say with like the privilege of a cis person, like, Black trans lives in particular are so in danger. And so, being really actively thinking about that, even as a cis person who's a member of like the large LGBTQ community, like that's something I hold with me, I think, in ways that like other folks, may not be as personal to them. And so then sort of bouncing off that, right? If you have the privilege to be in a position where you have a platform, where you have folks that are listening to you, whether you're a coach, whether you're on a team, if you have a social media profile, if you have a company, right? How are you using that platform and that privilege for change? And so when it comes into what can you do, it's everything from, are you promoting Black creators? Are you promoting Black authors, Black illustrators, and like folks of color, Indigenous folks, right? Are you doing land acknowledgement when you're introducing an event? And so just for, context, land acknowledgement, basically you acknowledge the fact that like all of land in America is Indigenous land, most of which was taken unlawfully from folks and has not been, dealt with very well. So that's something that folks tend to say at like the beginning of meetings and gatherings, and something I should have said is like, right now I'm on, like Quinnipiac land, and I'm aware of that, I'm thinking about that, and I'm communicating that to other people on a larger platform. Things like that, things like sharing your pronouns. I use she, her pronouns, right? Again, some of these things are really little, right? And I think that's something I cannot emphasize enough. A lot of this is really little for folks that have, like both of those examples are like, I'm not Indigenous, and I'm not someone who is, and I'm cis. And so those are two very small things that I can do that make a huge difference for folks that, do fall under the categories of Indigenous and trans, right? And using this platform to actively take the time to talk about it is huge in terms of, right, what does that look like if you're the CEO of a company? What does that look like if you're the marketing and outreach person, right? In your day job, in the pool, out of the pool, right? How are you using your privilege? How are you actively thinking about how to use your privilege to make sure other folks' voices are heard? And are you standing up for those folks when they're not in the room? Are you correcting someone about, another person's pronouns when they're not in the room, right? So making sure that like you're using your privilege in a way that allows other folks' voices to be heard and other people's opinions to be heard, and really uplifts folks who are marginalized, I would say. That's sort of the last big thing. And then of course, right, time, money, right, donate, call, email. Everyone can contribute in different ways. There are literally YouTube videos that you can watch and just have them streaming in the background, and the revenue goes to like various folks who are, out there protesting right now. So all of those things are things that you can do. There are a lot of small things that, like, if you do them all together, add up. And don't be afraid to question things. I think the biggest thing that's helped me is sort of most broadly overall is that like anything that we take for granted that we think is true, that is the thing that should be questioned, right? And so, if you just look at like everything from like, right, marriage, we presume marriage is a man and a woman, like let's question that. We presume that there are, even two genders, like let's question that. So anything that you sort of take for granted as being true, that is the thing to question. And so I think that's probably the last bit of it, and that's a little bit more abstract, I suppose, but something I would just recommend doing in everyday life.
Look, you hit on a lot of stuff here. I think, this almost felt like a little bit of a like a class, right? You have so much knowledge about this. I feel like people should kind of, if you watch this once, go back and hit it again, because you do touch on so many different things. And it's kind of a theme of what we talked about today, but a lot of small things add up, right? So if you're coming at this for the first time and thinking, to your point, how can I be of use? It doesn't need to be, as you touched on earlier, some grand over the top gesture where you try and start a new organization or do something else. Now, if you have resources, by all means use them, but it can be a little thing like you talked about, right? Whether it's the cap thing or asking yourself questions. There's an old adage in sports, right? If you feel like you're always open, whether it's water polo or basketball, it means you probably can't shoot. So ask yourself that question: why don't they guard you? And it's the same thing talking about rosters and things like that. If you don't have anyone that doesn't look different than the team you currently have, ask yourself, why? Is that a thing that could be changed? Is there a way to make an impact there, for a different part of your community? This has been really, really good. But before we kind of go, just a couple of more things. What else? You've hit on so many things, so I don't want to try and dilute anything you've said previously. But is there anything else you feel like you didn't get a chance to touch on that it's important for people to know? Because I'm in agreement with you, and the reason why we're having this talk and why we're going to have more talks is that, use the analogy of, it can't be a wave that crashes, right? It needs to be a sustained thing that goes, throughout, and not a thing that we just revisit every time there's a tragedy, right? So is there anything else you want folks to know?
I think the biggest thing, right, is it's not going to be easy. This was not meant to be easy work. If you feel uncomfortable, if you feel like you're doing something that doesn't feel like quite normal, that's intentional. That's how it's supposed to feel. And you really need to lean in, especially for folks who are allies. You really need to lean into that discomfort and say, what does that say about me, right? What does it say about me if I'm not comfortable with this? And sort of really, I think, just don't expect it to just sort of be like, oh, I can post my black square on Instagram, right? Real sacrifice and real dismantling means that what you think right now, right, needs to be deeply interrogated, and that's not going to be easy. That's not going to be neat. And it also means that we are so trained to think of our latent privilege as being equal. And so what I mean by that is whenever we try to we're here, right? Other folks are here. Whenever we try to do this, people think, oh my gosh, that's so radical. That's so dangerous. They think we're doing this, and it's here, right? When we talk about even just Black Lives Matter, it's we're not saying that other people don't matter. We're saying right now, right, the way that our infrastructure works, Black folks matter less. And that's why they need to matter at the same level as everyone else. And so, yeah, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be pretty. And it will mean giving up things that are sort of luxuries to folks who have privilege. And so be okay with that. That's good. That means that we're becoming better people, and that means that right, the same way that if you start feeling pain, right, when you're working out, I mean, obviously injury is different, but pain, right? That means you're getting better, right? And that's not going to be easy. It's not going to feel good. No one likes doing no one likes doing 500 fly, right? No one likes doing 500 fly sprint, but it will make you a better person and a better teammate. And so just really recognizing that that's part of it.
Yeah, you hit on something that water polo players can relate to. If you've played water polo, you've dealt with some discomfort, right? Maybe it's learning how to egg beater for the first time, or doing some very, very long swim set, but it made you better. It made you better at the game. Last thing before you go, I noticed on your Instagram recently you talked about how you felt like I think it was your high school program was a very inclusive one, and maybe you thanked a coach or someone that was involved with your program. Just to give a little of your experience, what did that look like? Why was that the feeling that you got then and that you still have now?
Yeah. So first of all, I think, part of the reason why I love my high school program so much, and that I will always talk about that, is because it actually looked very different than what my day-to-day looked like in terms of high school classes. In my high school classes, despite being the fourth most diverse high school in the country, I was very regularly the only student of color in AP and honors classes, right? For a school that is almost equally proportioned, of everyone, I was all of 0.08 of the Black people in my AP physics class, right? And so for me, that was like quite exhausting, and is something that like infrastructurally folks need to think about, right? Like where are people in these high performing classes? It's definitely not because they're not smart enough, especially because like the gifted and talented results show that like there's parity. So what's good with that? But getting to go to water polo practice was a completely different experience. One, I think, right, when we talk about, you know, who are you hiring, who has power in the room, the fact that my coaches were coaches of color was huge. Both of them were named Nestor. They were both kind of, you know, very strongly emotive Argentinian guys. And so, but the fact that practice was bilingual, the fact that I know, you know, both some like useful words and also some very bad words in Spanish now, because like, right, that was being used to practice, the fact that coaches were talking to athletes who were bilingual, who spoke Spanish at home in Spanish when it wasn't clicking in English, right? That was huge. That was huge for getting people in the program. That was huge for keeping people in the program. And I think, so that was just sort of the start of it, right? Who's in power in those spaces and who's cultivating that environment? And that those people were people of color was extraordinary and unusual in a lot of ways for water polo. So I think that was the first thing. And then I think the second thing was just that when, you know, and that was, and like that also reflected, you know, how was the team going to be composed? You did have a lot of folks of color in water polo, even though it's normally a predominantly white sport. You did not have those kids joining the lacrosse team, and that wasn't an accident. That was like a very, you know, intentional product of the environment that the coaching staff and the folks coordinating the program had created. And so I think that for me has been really huge. And, you know, I'm still really close with a lot of the girls that I played with in high school. Yeah, I was actually supposed to go back to coach this summer pre-pandemic. And so I always try to drop by over winter break, you know, always try to stay up to date with what the team is doing. My dad does some strength and conditioning coaches for them because my dad is the biggest believer in prehab that I've ever seen in my whole life. But yeah, I think that's sort of really what made it happen. And I think that's sort of a good model, right? For like, how is that looking at other teams? How are we being inclusive? How are we talking about those issues? What are the things that might make a difference that you wouldn't have necessarily thought of? So yes, big things. And then my college program as well has been, you know, really wonderful. Obviously different environment, different pool of people to draw from too. But, you know, I think they're a really good example of people who've been thinking really thoughtfully about, right, how are we changing this space? What haven't we done in the past and how can we fix it in the future? And so it's been very heartening to see that over the past few months as well.
Mariko Rooks, really appreciate you taking the time here. This the first of, I'm sure, a lot more that we're going to hear from you and all the great folks you're working with, both on task force and with the Alliance as well. So keep an eye out for that more here and all of our social media channels. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you soon.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really excited for the work going forward. So again, yeah, hopefully you'll hear from us soon.
Definitely.
All right. Have a wonderful evening.